All right, everybody, welcome to the Almost Awesome podcast. We're at episode number 23, and today we got something a little different planned for you guys. As you can tell, I'm in a different setup. Matt, I believe, is also at a different setup, so apologies if things are a little off, but we wanted to make sure that we were still consistent with the podcast, giving it to you every Monday 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Um, but we figured after doing a good amount of podcasts that we would try to essentially have a review episode where we would take a look back at the past few episodes that we've gone through and try to talk to more of you guys, the audience, about you know um, how how do we what are we doing to like better engage in more meaningful conversations? Because like after doing so many, we realized we kind of like just do it, but we don't really talk about how we go about doing it in like everyday life. Um,
Yeah, and I feel like it for us it'll be a good way to also reflect on the last episodes, kind of, really appreciate the lessons learned. Really look at, were those conversations meaningful? How do we improve on those? What were our takeaways? What did we like? All of that stuff. And we thought that it would be really cool to do this kind of format at the start of each month, and kind of look back at the previous month. So for this specific one, we're going to be looking at, some of the episodes that we had in November, and looking at those episodes, seeing what we liked, what we didn't like, all that good stuff.
oh, and just um, as a heads up, quick heads up, this episode is going to be a pre-recording, so me and Matt won't be able to uh, directly engage with you guys, the audience, for this episode. But when it actually does go live, we'll be there in chat, so we'll be able to hear you guys out and actually talk to you guys through there. So unfortunately, like us within this video, we won't be able to react to what you guys say in chat, but we'll definitely be there on Monday when it goes live.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I guess into jumping into the meat of it and the point of this episode is, um, are we actually having? Do we notice ourselves having deeper conversations within our just everyday social interactions? Like, do we see ourselves kind of almost um, almost keeping in mind like oh, like I want to try to have more meaningful conversations as opposed to just like a um, I mean, I don't want to put it as like a forgettable sort of conversation, but something like more than just like, hey, how's it going? How you doing? How's
Mm-hmm.
work? Like the small talk kind of things.
Yeah, and I love that because I think for us, it's like, are we actually practicing what we preach? Are we like accomplishing the point of this podcast, which again is like to have more meaningful conversations? So I guess to start, Mark, like, what are your thoughts? Have you felt like you've had more meaningful conversations? And I know for this podcast, we're specifically looking back for this month, but I think for this specific question, it would be cool to say, from the since we started this podcast, do you feel like you've had more deep conversations? Do you think the podcast has helped you grow in that sense?
Hmm. I'm not. I'm not 100% sure. Um, it may have just been a mix of um, just different sort of things happening around in my life where things from my end kind of went a little like haywire, a little crazy. So things kind of got serious. So whenever like um, I would like reach out to people to have like conversation, like it's like, hey, I got a lot of stuff off my chest. Can I talk to you about it?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think honestly, I think it did help. Um,
Mm-hmm.
maybe not consciously, but I think just like being comfortable, like just like shooting the topic, something that we
Mhm.
tend to do in our podcast. Like I know early on, um, we used to think like it was super awkward to jump from point A to like point D.
Mhm.
Um, and after doing the podcast a couple times, we were like, well, it isn't really that awkward, right? If you think about it like a normal conversation, that sort of thing kind of does happen fairly frequently. Like once there's like an end, once you see like the end of point A, you can go wherever you want. It doesn't have to go like in sequential order.
Mhm.
Um, so almost just having that comfortability to like jump around for different
Mhm.
topics. Like if you know like someone's strapped in for the ride for the conversation, like you can just kind of go with it, right? You can go anywhere with it.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel like it's been pretty similar for me. I think it was interesting because I think the changing of topics was so much more apparent in the podcast format.
Hmm.
But then I realized, like, for me, I learned better how to do it in the podcast because I realized normal conversations are like that.
Hmm.
And then it was interesting because I think there was a certain point where I realized that the podcast and having a conversation doesn't have to be too different. I think there's a middle ground that I'm still trying to find the beauty of. I think I've already learned how to make the podcast better and like our conversations better from the things I do in normal conversation.
Hmm.
I think now it's looking at how do I make my normal conversations better based off what I've learned in the podcast. And I think that's where I'm still kind of getting there. Um, but I can say like with confidence that I do feel like I'm able to have deeper conversations now. And I don't know, maybe it's like I'm taking more notice of it. Maybe like I think, in all honesty, there might have been a chance where I'm having the same number of deep conversations or the same like value in conversation. I'm finding that same value,
Hmm.
but it feels like now I look for those things and I appreciate them more, which I think is really cool. I think I wouldn't have noticed it as much if we
If
didn't
we did.
start this podcast.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that's one of my favorite things is now when I have a conversation that means something to me, I become more grateful for it.
Nice.
Because I realize like when we do this podcast, we're structuring a meaningful conversation. So when
Hmm.
it happens like naturally or organically, it's kind of cool to see all the same parts come together
Right.
in a unplanned way.
Hmm. Yeah, I was gonna say that too. I know for me, I think in the podcast, I think I've gotten better at like developing topics and like almost just jumping right in to
Hmm.
like a deep topic, which is kind of like the point of like the pre-show, kind of like to
Hmm.
get out the little bits of like the small talk, and then once the show starts, like we can kind of like dive right in. We can have like our casual topics in the pre-show, and then once we get started, we're able to like you know uh, get into some serious topics, some meaningful talks.
Yeah.
So in the podcast, I definitely see myself like getting better at uh, like facilitating a deeper conversation.
Mm.
Outside the podcast, I think it's still weird for me um, because with our podcast setting, we have time to like develop things. We think about like the topics just to make sure everything goes smoothly. And in an organic conversation, it's kind of like in the moment.
Mm.
Or
Hmm.
if it's something that's kind of just like been on your mind for a while, and you're like what I said for me, for my situations, where it's just like, hey, I need to get like some stuff off my chest. You know, could you could you lend me an ear? Could you give me some advice and stuff like that?
Hmm.
Um, so I definitely do I need to figure out how to go about um, like starting up a deep conversation. I think like that's like I think once I'm in there, I can get comfortable in it. since like
Mm.
we have the practice doing the podcast, but it's just how do I get started?
Yeah, I, I I think you captured it really great because what I noticed with the podcast, what makes it to me so easy for it to flow sometimes is that everyone that's in it goes into it with the expectation that this is going to be like a conversation that's meaningful. That's
Mhm.
going to, we're going to try to dig a little bit deep. We're going to have a mini format. We're going to like ask questions that, you know, open people up a little bit and
Mhm.
share themselves with us and with the world. And I think when you have that expectation set, it makes it really easy, at least from my perspective as a host, to like ask the questions.
Mhm.
Like, because I know in regular conversation, there's sometimes where I'm like in that middle ground where I'm like, oh man, is it okay if I ask this? Am I gonna be like pushing too far? Am I being nosy? But
Mhm.
then when we go into the podcast realm, like this specific setup, I don't ever feel that way. I
Mhm.
always feel like it's all fair game, and I, so far at least, we haven't. I feel like we've never got to a point where someone was like, "Dang, I can't believe you asked me that."
Yeah, where
Like,
like it's gotten like uncomfortable.
yeah.
Yeah.
But then it's interesting because then I'm also thinking like, man, maybe I'm being too much in my head in regular conversations
Mhm.
because I think at the end of the day, I know the questions you shouldn't ask,
Right.
but I think there's times where my mind overthinks it and then treats too many things and like puts too many questions in that bucket.
Ah, okay.
Um, and then I'm like, oh man, everything can kind of fit in that bucket if you think about it too hard.
Mhm.
And I think that's the issue that I'm trying to get over still. But again, I think it's a process.
Yeah.
I I wanted to ask you, do you can you remember like your last meaningful conversation outside of the podcast?
Ooh. Um it's funny because when when I think about it, I'm like, man, I feel like my memory for like conversations is like really terrible. Like
Mm.
even thinking back to like previous guests, sometimes I think back, I'm like, man, what did I like? Did I have this? It happened. Uh, shoutouts to Ryan. Like I talked to him one time and like I'd completely forgotten that he was on the podcast. I was like, I'm pretty sure I did, but I can't I don't remember exactly like what we talked about. And
Mm.
then like just like thinking about it, I was like I had to dig like deep into my mind. I'm like, what did we talk about? What did we talk about? And like at some point, like obviously once like we went our separate ways, I like remembered. I was like, oh my goodness, like these are the things that we talked about. It wasn't that it wasn't like meaningful or memorable. There's just
Mm.
times like where there's just so many other things going on that I can't I can't like recall. I would say
Mm.
it's almost like they're like small like innate like points that you kind of like pick up and you're like, oh yeah, I remember learning this from this last podcast. I remember learning this from doing this. Um,
Mm.
but honestly, I'm not too sure. I can't really I can't recall of one where it wasn't uh like me whining about like my dating life. Which
Mm.
I mean in some cases like I think like it can get deep depending on like
Yeah.
where it kind of goes. But
Mm.
I know for for the most part, most of like my I guess like my deeper conversations have been uh from just troubles with the ladies, man.
Mm. That's interesting. I guess this leads me to another question, and this is going to be really hard. To you, what constitutes a meaningful or deep conversation? So I guess like to you, what do you can what like what's your classification for them? I know
I,
it's not super
it,
easy to put on paper, but
like originally I would have said I would say something like um where I would gain something out of the conversation. Like
mm,
I would have learned something through this discussion, or my viewpoints may have been changed or solidified
mm,
after discussing whatever point it was with whoever.
mm,
Um, but I think now when I think about it, it's changed where it shouldn't just be me that gets something out of it. It should be the both of us,
mm,
where it's
mm.
me and um, I don't know the proper. I was gonna say conversational.
the other party.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like
It's
both
weird.
parties should
Yeah,
have
the
should
person you're talking to. Yeah.
both parties should gain something
Mm.
from that conversation.
Hmm.
Um, so that's why I feel like I haven't really had a meaningful conversation because it's more of just like me being like, hey, I need help because I don't know what's going on, and I
Mm.
need advice. So it seems like it seems like it's just me uh like gaining a benefit from it. But
Hmm.
like I said, I mean, it could just be someone else like solidifying like, their viewpoints or being like, you know, um, maybe like maybe my problem is relatable to them, and they're
Hmm.
like, oh, I've gone through this before, and let me tell you like, you know, what really works from my experience, kind of thing. Um,
I got you. So then I guess so. I mean that makes complete sense. But for me, I guess the problem with that is that it becomes really hard to tell when someone else takes something away from the conversation, unless sometimes people are explicit and they'll be like, "Hey, the conversation like meant a lot to me." But I feel like people don't really say that
mhm,
enough. You know, usually when I leave a conversation, I don't usually go like, "Hey, that was a really nice talk. I really appreciated it."
mhm,
Which now it makes me think like maybe I should do that more, because there is a lot of times where I come away from something and I'm like, man, I learned a lot from this, or like I really needed that.
mhm,
And I think being open to sharing that kind of would help both parties realize, this is a good conversation. I need to remember it because not only did I learn, but it was the same for them as well.
mhm.
Which I think that's interesting. But I like your definition of it. I think it is cool. Like at the end of the day, it's like a, a place where both parties gain value from the talk.
Mhm.
Like just asking how are you sometimes doesn't really deliver value. It's like a pleasantry.
Right.
And I think that isn't meaningful. It's like when you anything past that to me becomes like into that realm of deeper conversation.
Mhm.
I would say for me as well, I'm thinking. Well, I think for me, and this was easy for me to answer about what I think my last meaningful conversation was, because more recently I feel like I've been talking to more people and getting to know more new people,
Mhm.
like with the new work, and
Right.
just me kind of pushing myself more. Um, that like it's interesting. I feel like now I'm a lot more open, like you said, to like jump into it really quickly.
Mhm.
When I know like if someone was like, "Hey, Matt, do you want to get a drink?" and I just met them, I think like, oh, I don't have to be shy, or like, there's still like a little bit of that testing the water feel,
Mhm.
but I feel more comfortable asking questions and like probing about them, and vice versa. Um, but it was pretty funny because like I was talking to someone that I just met, and she was like, "Man, like I feel like we really got to know each other really quickly because we've been talking like this, and like everyone else I talk to is just like memes and what's ups and like like she was so used to everyone like being so surface level,
Mhm.
um that she was like, yo, this was really crazy. And I think it's really interesting because there are people that want to communicate on that surface level,
Yeah.
and you want to scratch for more but they won't let you in,
Mhm.
and that becomes discouraging. But for me, I found someone right now that like actually two people. I feel like someone at work and like someone on the personal side that both have been kind of open to like wanting to get to know me and me wanting to get to know them,
Mhm.
and like seeing that dynamic I think is really really cool for a fresh start. um so that's my most recent one. I think I don't think I would have been able to do it close to as well if it wasn't for the podcast. So I think it's cool. But needless to say, I think there's still room to grow.
S- Speaking of that, something you mentioned there kind of sparked a question in my mind,
Mm.
where it's, I guess for me the best example is just to use me. Um, I feel like I think I am. I think I'm open for like deeper conversations, but um, it's from my end, I feel like it's weird to almost just like poke and prod at people and like even
Mhm.
like there are a couple of times where I did it on our podcast where we would do like a how are you kind of thing, and like
Mhm.
I know specifically I did it to I'm pretty sure it was Kyle, where it's like
Mhm.
I did like a how are you, and then like he kind of like stumbled and stuttered like before he gave an answer, and I was like no, that means you're lying. What's going on? Because if
Mhm.
you know exactly what how you're feeling, then you can say it like right away. There's no question about it, right?
Mhm.
But like I guess my question to you is like how do you go about like almost like facilitating that, like where like it's almost like you're how do you show that like you're open for like a deep talk and almost like invite that in, because I guess you can only do so much, right? Because it's up to the other person to like
Reciprocate.
yeah, right.
Yeah. I think what I started to do was be really, really focused and direct about what I want to know about somebody.
Mhm.
And I think that was the big game changer. Um, especially, and I think for me, it's more relevant with one of my new coworkers. Is like every time I asked them a question, I like knew exactly what I wanted to get out of it from them. So, for example, like what I was really interested in was like what was his history, because like this coworker, he's a lot more experienced than me, and what I wanted to know was like how did he get here? What was his journey like? What could he teach me? Like what was his lessons learned? I think those were the things that I like wanted to really get to know.
Mhm.
So I started the conversation that way. I was like, I'm really interested in how you like what was your career like when you first started? Did you start here? And then how did you get to where you were at? That like I remember asking him that really specifically. Um, and I think this is interesting because I think at the same time, if you show that you're interested in somebody and what you want to know about them, I think it becomes really easy for them to give it up because they are like people like to feel like they're interesting
Mhm.
because I think in all honesty they are. But what ends up happening is you kind of go into like a weird tango where it's like, man, I want to share who I am with this person, but I don't know if they're gonna take it. And
Mhm.
it's like the other person feels the same way, and it
Mhm.
almost takes one person like to have the courage to just
Just
ask
right.
and jump into it. Um, so that's what I started to do was like really really be focused on what I want to know about a person because I realized this as well, and I think this related more to girls for me was like when you say tell me about yourself, it doesn't do anything. Like it's so broad, and people start to. It's like the openness of it paralyzes people.
Mhm.
Um, so instead, I try to be like really really focused and think about what am I interested in, and let's focus the conversation on that because then I'm gonna be engaged,
Mhm.
and I'll like, and then I kind of, especially when it's like a girl, it's like I don't know if they're engaged yet, but based off their answer, I can
You can
tell what
tell.
is important to them or what's not important to them,
Mhm.
and then I can either pivot because now, like it's like what we did with the podcast. Now I know hey, I can just ask another question.
Mhm.
I can just jump
Let's
into
go
one other
next one.
topic.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then both parties are okay with it. Like if I think it's the right time, then we'll just go that direction. Um, and then I'll keep scratching the surface.
Mhm.
But I think the biggest thing was like I realized I had to stop being in my head so much about it. I
True.
think I think if someone doesn't want to share them with me, like who they are with me, um, it's up to them to just tell me that. But
Mhm.
until then, I'm gonna ask.
Right.
And if I feel like I'm making them uncomfortable or anything, like I think my instincts will be good enough, but I'm not gonna let myself do that by not taking action.
Mhm.
I told myself I'm gonna ask the question first, and then if I see something strange, I'll stop. But I'm not gonna stop myself from asking the question because of something that hasn't happened yet.
True. True. I
Mm-hmm.
like those. The two big things is because one thing that stood out to me was basically have a game plan. And I know like I'm terrible at having a game plan.
Mm-hmm.
Even with I catch myself even with parts of the podcast where I'll have I'll have like a small idea. I'll
Hmm.
have like little topics or like bullet points, but then when I go to like actually like asking the question, it just seems like mumble jumbled, or like my brain kind of is just like it's just like off in its own place, and I'm like, wait, you have the notes right there, like just just read the notes.
Yeah.
uh, but like even in real conversation, I definitely uh, I don't go in like with a game plan, and it makes sense. Like figure out like what you said, like figure out what do you want to learn about like this new person, right? Figure
Hmm.
out like uh, I guess another thing that stood out was um, like don't give like a super broad uh,
Hmm.
question that can result in like a million different things. It's almost like people get overwhelmed with too many options.
Hmm.
Um, where it's just there's too many choices that I could talk to them about this, I could mention this, I could talk about this, but like just having it like direct, or almost like you kind of like corral them into like speaking about one thing. Um,
Yeah.
it makes it a lot easier where like you said, you can know immediately, am I super into this topic, or do I am I not really into it and I don't really want to talk about it. Like
Hmm.
you kind of get like it's usually one of those two um, sorts of answers, and you can kind of get a feel for it uh, once they start talking, or if they don't want to talk about it, right? Like
Yeah.
that's kind of it.
And I think, yeah, I mean, and it makes it amazing because when you take, for me, that on that second point, when you take that approach, you get so much information, even if they makes them uncomfortable or they don't want to talk about it. That alone gives you a lot to work with.
Hmm.
Like you kind of realize you do like the negative, or like you think of the what's um absent, or like if this is something they don't like talking about, like if they don't like talking about school, then they're not into that. And
Yeah.
then I still learned about them, and I think that's the key point. Um, but I one thing that I thought was really interesting, um, is I think what's really cool about the podcast and me and you is I also think our styles on how we do things is so different. Um, and I think it's always been interesting because it isn't just like with the podcast or conversations, but I'm even thinking about like if we were to working on an almost awesome video, or if we like when we emceed for FSA for Sayao,
Hmm.
like our styles are so different. You're more of a like improvise, think of it on the
I'm
spot,
just a wing it guy.
and like wing it. Yeah, and I think
Hmm.
it's amazing because like for me, it was always like, man, when you do it, it's like holy crap. He just it when it works, it's just like, dang,
Hmm.
I can't imagine myself winging it and it working. Um, or like me, I realize what ends up happening when I try to wing things is if I'm not prepared for it and I try to wing it, I'll fail because I'm like uncomfortable while winging it.
Hmm.
But if I'm like feel confident in winging it, I can do it.
Hmm.
And the way I build that confidence is by preparing.
Hmm.
And I think the key is the confidence portion. And I always thought that was really amazing about you was I think when you wing it and you find the right direction, you run with it and it's like
Yeah.
holy crap, this guy just like it just it just like looks like magic.
Hmm.
And I think that was I've always thought that was amazing.
Because it's funny because I'm the exact opposite of you, where there have been times where I mentioned it to you before, where like I was like, okay, I need to have like a game plan for things like this, whether it's conversation or like just like if we're gonna put it out there like emceeing or like a big event kind of thing. Like I should have a game plan for this.
Mhm.
And there are times where I'll think of a game plan. I'll be like, all right, here's like the possible options. Like here's what I'm gonna do for this and this and this, and like here's contingency plans. But what happens to me, like I want to say like almost 100% of the time, is that step one fails. Step one almost always just fails. And then I'm
Mhm.
like, well, we're winging it. Like because step one didn't work, step one
Yeah.
was like the core of like the whole plan. So because
Like
that didn't work, like it's just like, well, plans out the window. We're doing it live, baby. So like that's why I feel like I need to really work on um like setting up, getting better at like planning or like even like thinking things out uh, better just to make things smoother. Because like you said, like when it works, it goes really well. But
Mhm.
I mean, I'm me, so I've seen it when it doesn't really work, and it's just
Mhm.
I'm just like kind of like flip flopping around. Uh,
Mm. Yeah. I and it's interesting because I feel like once you're in that moment, you instantly are like, "Fuck, this is what I should have done better."
yeah, yeah.
And then I think it for me it's always like, do I actually learn my lesson or do I like go through it again?
Mhm.
And I mean sometimes it takes multiple times
Mhm.
and multiple errors. But I do remember my breaking point was actually it started because of work where I realized like, man, I really, really want to plan things to feel comfortable because I got to a point where I was like in a meeting. I was in I kept being in these meetings for work where I had to present or I had to say something, and I would be so uncomfortable, and I would like choke up and I would get nervous, and it got to such a point where I was like, okay, f this. I'm going to pull up a notepad and I'm going to write down word for word exactly what I'm going to say for this meeting.
Mhm.
I'm going to treat it just like a speech. And since it's online or on the phone, I'm just going to literally like read
Just
it
read it.
out and I'm going to like prepare to it at such a level where like nothing can go wrong because it's just me speaking and here are all
Mhm.
my thoughts. Boom, end of story. And then like it's not like a performance or like there's very few variables there.
Right.
Um and then it was like okay, once I realized once I started to do the prep work, it became easier for me to wing things because I could feel comfortable that I like did my homework or I
Mhm.
prepared for it enough. And I mean, at the same time, I knew what I wanted to talk about because I sat there and organized it.
Mhm.
Where it's like at one point, like after doing it once or twice, I would do it anyways, but I wouldn't look at the notes anymore. I
Mhm.
would just know what I wanted to say because I took the time to prepare, and I
Right.
felt more confident because I was like, you know what, I put my time into this. I can do this.
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, it's kind of interesting because like as I'm saying this out loud, I realize like, man, this is just like giving a speech or a presentation or studying
Mhm.
for a test in like fifth grade,
Mhm.
but it's like relearning that lesson 20 years later when you're like
Yeah.
in a work environment. It kind of like made me realize, yeah, this is my style,
Mhm.
and I'm gonna like now that I know it, I kind of keep running with it.
Mhm.
So I think that was a big thing for me. Um, but yeah, I think this podcast again is like help. I mean, it's helped me so much with that.
Mhm.
Like, but it's also helped me realize, um, like I want to get better at the improvisation part because I think the really cool thing is like both of our styles are kind of right and necessary
Mhm.
because it's like exactly what you said. That, like when plan one doesn't work, you gotta improvise.
You gotta find something else. You can't just like be like, oh, we're ghosting,
Mhm.
we're ghosting out this conversation now. And if you're in person, you're just like, what? You just turn around and just like walk off somewhere.
Yeah, it's like
You
see
can't
ya.
really do that in a business meeting, right? You just like, oh, gotta poop.
I gotta go.
Like, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
it's a weird mix of like, it sounds dumb because I feel like we say it for everything, but
Hmm.
it really is just finding that good mix of both.
Mm-hmm.
Where like planning enough where like you said, you plan enough where you have the confidence where if things don't go right, you can be like, okay, here's my list points, and I can just go, you know the step one kind of flubbed up, but we can
Hmm.
recover going two, then three, then four, and you know then you can go with the improv. Like if things like I guess I kind of see it in a comedic sense, like where
Hmm.
when a joke hits, you kind of just keep running with it, right? You kind of milk out the laughs as much as you can, and you just ride the high. But then at some
Hmm.
point, you got to go to the next one, and then it's a weird game of just like hitting and missing, and just hoping that you can just keep hitting as often as possible.
Hmm.
But definitely having that plan, like it's it's nice having that like that safety net of when you don't get that hit, because you're not always you can't plan for every possible situation, so that's why you need to be able to like improv, right? But
Hmm.
it definitely helps just to know like where are you going, like what's your next step. And I know that's definitely a problem with me where I get lost in like what I'm talking about, or just my mind is kind of just it's just like a huge like scattering of like thoughts and stuff, and it's hard for me to just formulate it in an organized fashion.
Yeah. I love that connection that you made to like the preparation and improv or comedy or doing a stand up. Like I want to ask you this question because you have the experience of doing like a stand up. Like you know that feeling where a joke lands
Mhm.
and you're like, "Oh, this is my opening. I'm
Mhm.
going to keep like I'm going to build on this."
Mhm.
Like I feel like it's like such it's so apparent from an audience, not from an audience's perspective, but like I've seen you do it where, or like even when we're brainstorming a video idea
Mhm.
where we like find an opening and then it blows the whole thing wide open
Mhm.
because we start to find that thread
Mhm.
that works. So my question is like, do you also feel that, like bringing that back and connecting it to the podcast, have you felt that before with some of our previous episodes or some of our previous conversations where like you ask the question the right way and then the thread like you're like, this is where I want to go with this.
There are a lot of times there are a lot of times where I do feel that,
Mm.
and it's I think it's mostly the reason why every time at the end of the podcast, like I'm frustrated. I'm
Mm.
like I can't believe we're out of time. We like I just want to keep going. I want to keep talking. And there are times where even like after the podcast, I'll be like, "Hey, I'm hanging around if anyone wants to talk." Like I'm on a roll right now. You got the gears grinding, like I'm ready.
Hmm.
Just throw it at me. I'm ready.
Yeah.
Um but I definitely do. There are times where I do get that feeling where like I'm riding the wave, but
Hmm.
at the same time, because I know that we have to have a time constraint, I like I'll get lost in it, and then I'll look at the time real quick, and I'll be like, oh, okay, like we gotta we gotta move on.
Hmm.
There's a timetable for these things, um, but there are definitely a lot of times where I'm like, man, I want to keep going, but then I'll just be like, all right, we gotta go next for this.
Yeah. I think that's really cool. I feel the same way. I feel like sometimes with our, it's interesting because I think with our podcast, it's consistent. I feel like we consistently get to feel that thread or that feeling of, man, I want to keep talking.
Hmm.
And it's amazing because we at the end of the podcast when we talk about it, we're always like, I can't believe the time went by so fast.
Hmm.
And I think that's also like another good indicator is like when you kind of lose track of the time, you know you're going in the right direction or you're having fun.
Hmm.
And then it's like an that's the only way I can like describe the feeling is like losing track of time
Hmm.
or like that thread. And it's just like this it's like a feeling. And that I love it that we can connect it to comedy and we can connect it to the podcast, the conversation, that it's all like similar in that regard.
Hmm.
But I do with all of that in mind, I also want to keep us on track for this
I,
episode.
I was about to do the same thing. I'm like,
Yeah. And I want to ask, like, going looking back into November, um, all the episodes that we've done, are there any ones that really stick out to you where like maybe it was like this feeling that like maybe it triggered early or maybe it
hmm.
triggered like harder than usual, um, that like come to your mind?
Um, to be honest, for me, it was oh, sorry,
No worries, no worries.
trying to do the titles at the same time. I was like, let me do it on time. Let me make it like so it seems fluid. I'm like, nope, this doesn't work. Gotta do one or the other. Okay.
You tried and then
I
it's like,
tried and I was
oh
like,
crap.
oh, typo. Now I got backspace. Um, I think my favorite one so far was with David Galindo.
Mm,
Um, because it was funny because there was like a whole bunch of like back stuff where I had him planned for like almost like a month before the podcast aired, and we were worried because I had my topic set out, and it was like things in my life kind of lined up with the topics that I had lined up for David, and at one point we were like, oh, we don't know if we're going to be able to get him anymore because, different work situations or just like the whole podcast setup. We were like, we don't know if it's even going to like work 100%. So I was just like, oh no, I don't know. Like, maybe I could keep the same podcast topics, but can I about it to someone else? And I was like, no, 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 no. These are like specifically fine tailored for, you know, David. And I guess
Mm,
it was a part of me that I felt like I really wanted to talk about it because like they it did have a lot of relevance to me at the
mm-hmm,
time, where it's just like, oh, this is super relevant for me, and I also know it can be pretty relevant to David.
mm-hmm.
So for me, that one was my favorite. Um, I don't know, there after like looking back on it, I know there are definitely like some things that I could have improved on for it, but I know the topic wise and the discussion and even like the depth of the conversation. I think for me, like I feel like that was like my peak so far. It's like the culmination of like
Mm.
things like really um, like everything kind of like worked.
Yeah,
I would say.
that's awesome.
Well,
That's really cool. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say, what about yours? What was your favorite episode so far?
Mine was in David's was episode 21, right? I think it was.
Yes, yes, yes,
And
yes.
that is uploaded on our YouTube now, right?
Mm-hmm. Huh. What was our? It's. I think it's Almost Awesome Pros, right?
And you
On
said David
YouTube.
Galindo?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'll have to check it out later.
David space.
My favorite was actually episode 22 with Andrew Ludwig.
Mm-hmm.
Then this was our last episode before this one.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think there's multiple reasons why I really like this episode. I thought this was really cool because for me, this was one of our first friends that I feel like was a little bit outside of our normal realm of friends.
Mm-hmm.
It was a little bit different, and I think because of that, like going into it, I was worried. I was like kind of worried, like, oh man, is it going to be awkward? Is it going to be like, are we going to really have to push this or pull a lot to get Andrew to like talk about things that are important to him?
Mm-hmm.
Are the topics going to be good? All of these things were like culminating in my mind, and I didn't know how it was going to turn out, and it like almost made me stressed. But at the same time, it was interesting because I also feel like this was one of the podcasts where, in terms of prep and lining everything up, we did like the least. I
Mm-hmm.
think like we didn't have a pre meeting like we usually do. We didn't like everyone was a little disconnected on what our questions or our themes were going to be for the evening.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then once we started the podcast, it flowed and it like all
Mm-hmm.
worked out. And I thought that was a really cool feeling because it like it's funny tying it back to like what we talked about earlier. For me, it was like, man, it felt almost like we improv this one. For me, if
Mm-hmm.
and like it felt good because it worked out and it wasn't as structured as normal, and we survived and worked out, and it actually felt like a really good one at the end of the day in terms of conversation, in terms of the flow of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Everything about it like felt good, and I think the way we prepped for it amplified that for me personally. Um, so I think that was really cool, and I think at the same time, like on a similar note that you mentioned, I think there are still improvements on our end. Like like what I mentioned, like we could have prepped a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we could have made sure everyone was really really aware of the themes. Like some of the things that are easy to do, planning things like, hey everyone, is everyone still good? Hey everyone, these are what we're going to talk about today.
Right,
All of
right.
that stuff. Like those are like easy buckets that I think um, it's a good reminder because I think as we do more episodes, it becomes easier to like be negligent or like kind of
Yeah.
let things slip and like let go of that rigor. And this was kind of a reminder, like, hey, even though it was a good episode, we got to keep doing those little things
Right.
to keep like
Mm-hmm.
fine tuning it. Um, but that was for me my favorite episode of November of this
Mm-hmm.
last month, and why? And I think that was really cool. And I think it's actually I think it's awesome because like the way I'm categorizing it is like I feel like I really like this episode because it felt like improvised, and it sounds like you really like this episode because the prep work for David's was like really well done,
Yeah.
and it's super cool that it kind of like it all mirrored this way.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I think that's really amazing.
Yeah. and like to add on to like the episode with Andrew, it was funny how uh I think all of us were kind of nervous, whether it was like the same sort of things or like different variables that made us nervous going into it.
Mm-hmm.
But afterwards, all of us were like, man, that was a blast. Like it was like a ton of fun. Like it was kind of there are points where it was a little nerve wracking where we're like, all right, is this gonna really flow? Are we like doing well with this? But afterwards, we were like, it was like it almost felt like a lot of the other podcasts where it's we just have like a good amount of time, like a good amount of fun where we just lose track of time, and then we're just like, man, we can't believe like it's over, but we still want to like, there's still so much like we could have added on to stuff. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so uh, it was awesome, great time with Andrew. So can't wait to talk with him again.
Yeah, I think it'll be really cool. Um, and I know we kind of talked about it on the episode level, but I think it would also be cool to do it on a broader level based off of November. Is like asking each other, what are the things that we in general and how do we want to improve them, like going forward. And I think like talking about it and being like specific on it will be really cool as part of this like reflection. So I want to ask you to start. Like, what are the things that you want to improve on, and how do you want to going into December?
Um, I think I kind of mentioned it before, just kind of having like do better in planning, and
Mm-hmm.
I would say specifically, um, really hash out the questions that I want to ask, um, and try not to think of just like the surface level questions or the basic questions about things. Kind of like dig a little deeper, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know uh, there are a lot of times where I'll have the topics, or like, because we'll, like we said, we do have like a preset amount of like topics, so that we all can kind of think about like, oh, what questions are we going to ask, what are we going to talk about, and stuff like that. Um, but I think specifically for me, I need to really like dig deep and figure out like the deep questions to ask. I
Mm-hmm.
catch myself a lot like just going on the surface level, and then like we'll go through the podcast. I'll be like, oh, okay, I can ask this question, and then before I have the chance, like someone else will ask it or someone else will mention it, and I'll be like, okay, cross that question off. I'm not gonna, I can't ask it anymore. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so by digging deeper, that kind of gives me an opportunity for, um, that obvious or that basic level question to not be asked, and um, I think it like it definitely helps just to show that I'm more interested, more engaged. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not like I'm not engaged because I'm having a passive role. There are a lot of times where I enjoy that, like just listening to the conversation unfold, and you know, um, you talk or our guests talk about whatever our topic of discussion really is.
Mm-hmm.
But I need to remember to kind of break out of that and um, just be more inquisitive.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for me, um, my step would be to add a step to my pre-planning. Have my topics, have my base questions, and then kind of dig a little deeper, so then I can add on a little bit more to the conversation, and hopefully, eventually, by doing the prep work in the podcast, it'll show dividends in real
Mm-hmm.
conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what
Amazing.
about you? What do you think you could work on or improve on?
Mm. I think for me, it becomes more on the end of like execution and planning and consistency. I think for me, I think what's cool is like we've established the routine of consistency for like every Mondays we're going to be live.
Hmm.
And what I want to do is establish that for the prep work for asking our guests who our next guest is, um, figuring out every what time should we tell everyone, hey, we're going to go, here's our theme, like the day before, kind of like establishing the processes that will just also continue to build the consistency of this podcast, not
Hmm.
just from going live, but like quality wise. How do we do those things every single time. So then we're always, you know, covering our gaps that
Mhm.
are like really easy to cover, but it's just kind of it's like what I mentioned earlier a little bit. It's like I feel like there's times where it gets comfortable to do this because it's like fun and because we have this consistency already with how we execute that I it's really easy to kind of get into a rut of let's just keep going and like let's not think about how do we keep improving if it's like small consistent changes.
Mhm.
um so for me what I want to do better at or start doing is actually like setting up time outside of the podcast hour to where it's like just me working on the podcast in some way shape or form.
Mhm.
Like maybe it's like 30 minutes a week and it's like on a Wednesday or Wednesday evening, Wednesday morning, I don't know what day, but it would be like this time is sacred for the podcast
Mhm.
and it's going to be spent either coming up with questions or maybe it is like figuring out who the next guest is. But when this 30 minutes hit, like I want to be working on this podcast and it like outside of course what we've already established, like
Mhm.
because I think for me it's like it's so easy to get caught up with like work with everything else that goes on. If I don't treat it and block that time off, it makes it like easy for me to give it away to something
Mhm.
else and like be lenient. But like once I start doing it and stick to it, it becomes part of like my schedule. And
Mhm.
then after a while, it like feels it's like going to the gym almost. Like when you start missing out, you feel bad. I want to feel that about like those blocks,
Mhm.
because I think there's a lot of small things that like I want to improve on this thing to make it more consistent.
It's like building a habit to devote time into working on the podcast, and then
Hmm.
it becomes routine, and then you
Hmm.
don't even notice it where you're like it just becomes natural, like, oh, I got to do this, or like, you know, like you mentioned, like, oh, it feels weird that I didn't do this, or I didn't put time, today to work on the
Hmm.
podcast like I should have. Um,
Yeah.
and it just goes back to like really like investing in something that you believe in, right? And like,
Hmm.
what what more valuable of a commodity is there other than like your time, right?
Hmm. Yeah. So I full disclosure, I have not been keeping track of time that much, and I'm not exactly sure where we stand right now.
We are kind of cutting it close. We're we're like about like 10 minutes away, to be honest. Um, I,
Okay.
I think I think it's a decent point where we could go ahead and call this a close just to make sure that we're on time. I don't want us to end up like slightly touching on a topic and then like diving deep into it.
Hmm.
Um,
So before we do that, what I want to do is just at least read one quote that I think was really cool, from our last episode, since we're
mhm,
still like in that look back
mhm,
phase. Um, and I think, and for me, it's important because I want our guests to also feel like they're part of the podcast, and I want to make sure like everyone that watches and everyone that comments or interacts in Twitch chat, like it means a ton to me and Mark. Like
mhm,
even if it's small, even if it's big, even if you're memeing or trolling, like you guys showing up and you guys commenting means so much to us, and we're still trying to figure out how do we show that gratitude to you guys. But this was really cool. Like Dragonmon has been a big follower on our podcast. She usually watches it in the recording, but for specifically the last episode with Andrew, we were talking about one of our questions we asked early on in the podcast was like, when you first meet someone, what do you focus more on? Is it um, getting to know them and asking them questions, or is it like sharing who you are as a person? And I think this is funny because it also connects with what we talked about earlier. But Dragonmon responded in chat during that episode. She said, "A huge factor in whether I vibe with someone first encounter is their interest in me. My most engaging conversations are like a push and pull questions to each other." And I think to me, I think it's really cool because it's like exactly what we kind of talked about is like when you show that you're interested in someone, it like becomes so much easier to have that conversation, get to know both parties because you know
Mhm.
someone's interested.
Mhm.
And that really resonated with me. So I just wanted to make sure like we give that a call. So thanks first off, Dragonmon, for like showing up to the podcast. Thanks for like helping us grow this thing. Like we really appreciate all the feedback you give us, and for being part of it. It means a lot.
I guess in terms of that too, I know Fontana's been like super active in our chat too, and just like asking relevant questions to, what we're talking about in the podcast, and even just like adding to the discussion. I know, because I kept note of it from a podcast earlier from with BJ. To be fair, I don't remember the number. I think it was 20.
20? I think it was 20.
I think it was 20
That one's on our YouTube too, right?
on Almost Awesome Pros.
Yeah.
I believe so. We'll have to double check on the YouTube. YouTube.com/channel/AlmostAwesomePros. I don't know. We'll check it out. Anyways, but we were talking about we ended up relating like gaming and dating, where
Mm.
it's kind of like a little bit of the same thing. Like you kind of sometimes you can jump right into ranked and just go on dating apps and try to get dates and just go and do it live.
Yeah.
Other times you gotta like take a step back, go to the training room and figure out how do I maximize my profile? How do I get myself started? How do I get myself ready for, you know, the online rank match of going out on an actual date?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but Fontana asked this question. In terms of girls in video games, at what point do you find yourself wanting to keep training in one game? And what point do you decide to play a whole new game? And we ended up bringing up the question. He even answered it, which was pretty cool too, to hear his viewpoint on his own question. And he said that I feel like I'm a bit of an extreme example, but I approach relationships and video games in the same way. I've found something that makes me happy, and I've made the conscious decision to fully commit to it, growing in that game/person.
That was good. That was I remember like that podcast. I was like, dang, this is pretty deep, and it was a good connection.
Yeah, and like we even like made like it was like a good tangent. Like we were just like, oh, this is a whole nother like discussion point that we can get into. So
Mm-hmm.
thanks to Funktana for adding that question, that discussion point to that
Mm-hmm.
episode with BJ DeCusin, number 20 from Almost Awesome Pros on YouTube.com.
And I think with that, we want to start introducing this new idea of like a AMA format, or like using this kind of section or these reflection podcasts as a way to better interact with you guys, our guests. Um, so we're still trying to figure out exactly how we execute on this. But even for now, if it is as simple as tweeting to me and Mark, or putting something on our YouTube in the comments, maybe even in this video, like feel free to ask us anything and bring it up as in like, hey, it would be really cool if you guys answered this on the podcast.
Hmm.
We're still figuring out that structure, but for now, like, talk to us in person, message us on Facebook, message us on Twitter, hit us in DMs, any possible way. Like, and if you have anything in mind, anything that you want us to bring into the podcast and talk about, like, me and Mark are really open ears, and we really want to, build this thing so it's everyone's engaged and kind of can be part of this thing as we grow it.
Hmm.
Um,
It's like we may be like the hosts, we may be the creators of this, but without you guys watching, like this doesn't really mean much, right? Um, so it definitely like any any sort of like input helps from you guys, and if we can get you guys like involved in like the show itself or in the podcast itself, um, like I feel like that would be awesome for us. Just like our small way of saying, thanks you guys for tuning in every week or whenever possible, because you can always catch them on
mhm.
YouTube.com/channel/AlmostAwesomePros.
And on that note, I want to also and like not only that, but we also me and Mark we're trying to also grow this thing from how do we produce more content? How do we like make it better for everybody? How do we like clip things or show highlights? So if anyone out there that's listening is interested in, being a mod or being a video editor, or even if it's like helping us organize things a little bit better, um, we're really open to having people join our team and like you know help us grow this thing from like an executional standpoint, or from
Hmm.
the backside of things, not just from the show and the production.
Hmm.
So again, like feel free to let us know, whether it is in Twitch chat, whether it is in Facebook, or talking to me and Mark in person, because like I think we can make this thing amazing, and if anyone wants to help us, we are more than happy to get that help.
Yeah. But unfortunately, it is about that time. Um, so, as usual, thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you guys for watching. Whether you're watching this live or watching this at your own convenience. Um, just as a heads up, we basically made the decision that um, we're going to be completely moving to YouTube now. I've had some issues streaming to both Twitch and YouTube at the same time, and we figured that it'll be easier to just stream straight to YouTube and then have it upload straight there. It just saves some work on our end, and it makes it I think easier and more accessible uh, for everybody um, to just view, listen, and and yeah. So unfortunately, we won't be having the podcast on my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/Pirate Lolo. That's going to be strictly for my lab reports and games. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
And so all of our podcast stuff from now on, until something else happens, it's going to be on our YouTube channel. So make sure that if you haven't already, go to YouTube, look up Almost Awesome Pros, subscribe to us there, and click the bell button. Click the bell button so you get notified whenever we do upload, whenever we go live, so you never miss out on any of these juicy conversations, and you never miss out on the opportunity to be a part of it.
Mm. So I think in classic fashion, what we're gonna do is we'll do a minute conclusion. Because we don't have a guest today, me and Mark will do a little bit of it. We'll do it a little bit differently, and I think the way we'll do it is I have my timer up. We'll do like 30 seconds, 30 seconds, and then we'll go from there, and we'll close it out.
Okay.
You good with that?
I
Do
think
you?
so. Let me get one last sip of water.
Okay. Do you want to do first? Do you want me to go first, and you want to close us out?
Sure. I'll go first. I'll go first.
You'll go first. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me know. You good?
Yeah, I think so. I hope so.
All right. I'll
We're gonna
hit you
wing
with.
it.
I'll give you the 3, 2, 1, go, and then you're off to the races. All right. 3, 2, 1, go.
So first and foremost, I want to thank you guys, the viewers, for tuning in and watching. Just hearing it from you guys, like that people are listening to this and they're enjoying it. It really like means the world to me. And I don't really know a better way. I don't know how else to really express how thankful I am um, for you guys tuning in. Um, but I guess the best thing I can do is just do my best to keep giving you guys quality content. And the best way I'm going to do that is by, working on my conversational skills, by practicing more, trying to be more engaging, more inquisitive, asking better questions, deeper questions, and kind of digging deeper um, into our guests and figuring more about them.
Nice. And I just want to say, echoing what Mark said, thank you guys for showing up to the podcast. Thank you. It means the world to us. And also, thank you to all the guests that have been part of this past podcast. Everyone that's made an appearance. Like, it means so much that you guys are willing to take the time out and have these conversations with us, because, like, we're making content, which is fun, but getting to know you guys is really amazing. And every single one of these episodes has been a blast. So I want to make sure we give that shout out to everyone that's been a part. And we're hoping to get more people on it, and hopefully we can, keep sharing the fun, keep having deep conversations, and we'll see you guys next time.
Can't wait to talk to more of you guys next time. So tune in next Monday, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, YouTube channel. You know it. We said it a billion times. We're out, boys. Bye.